really pleased to be here and interact with this very diverse group. I think we have academics, researchers, and administrators here. I will start by briefly introducing myself before handing over to Mark. My name is Anna Priska-Lose, and I'm a third-year doctoral student at the Hertie School in Berlin, which is a public policy school. And I work on educational governance topics, especially higher education governance. And in my dissertation, I look at how different higher education systems have responded to Brexit and COVID in terms of their internationalization strategies. And as part of this research, obviously, the digitalization of internationalization has been a huge issue and something that all my interviewees have reported about and that I became about. And I was glad to connect with Mark, who is working on a very similar topic.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everybody. My name is Mark. I'm from Coventry University in the United Kingdom. And I'm investigating specifically collaborative online international learning. I'm in my second year of my studies, just about to embark on my data collections phase. I think it's been such a timely time to embark on a study of collaborative online international learning because of the whole pandemic. The whole idea of virtual learning has really come of age, and people are seeing it in a different light. So I think it's a very topical issue, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about it today. Very pleased to be here. Thank you, Matty and Anna. I'll hand back over to Anna to start the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, let me start the presentation. Okay, I'm getting an error message. 1 second. Okay, are you seeing the presentation mode now?
Yeah, we're seeing it, Anna.
Perfect. Great. So let's get started with our presentation on collaborative online international learning and virtual exchange. As we just introduced ourselves, it's by Mark and me. We have an overall introduction to the topic from the perspective of researchers who have embarked into the field, and we're of course very interested in hearing your perspectives too in the Q&A and later during the webinar. We first wanted to give an overview into how digitalization and higher education have intersected in the past and what the big buzzwords have been kind of existed for a while and that are currently being discussed. Then we will really get into the nitty-gritty of what is Coil and virtual exchange, as there's currently also a lot of discussion around the concepts and how do we define these concepts, as this is very much something that is has just come into being and being explored more vastly recently. We will look into some notable virtual exchange projects that have been initiated from different stakeholders in the education sphere. Finally, we will report on some recommendations that we have collected from our experiences with people who have been involved in conducting virtual exchanges. So let's start first by saying that the idea of learning across a time and space distance is not something that is new. It has, of course, become super relevant now during the pandemic, but the idea of learning that is constrained and that learners do not share the same situation with each other has been around for centuries. So when we look back at, for instance, the University of London or the Open University, they have used distance learning for a very long time. And there have been different media that were leveraged for this, starting from radio, then moving on to television, and now computers as we know it. You will remember that some 10 years ago, this huge buzz around MOOCs, massive open online courses. So this was really when large-scale internet access had been sort of implemented everywhere, where higher education was sort of experimenting with this. And here the idea was that high quality education courses could be made available to a large audience. So the focus was really on the learner for whom it was possible to get access to collections of open information and to communicate via virtual platforms with other learners. So there were MOOCs that solely served to replicate information that just made lectures available, but then there were also these CMOOCs, cooperative MOOCs, that really served as learning platforms where there was also some kind of cooperative learning taking place. This was debated to really revolutionize education, but it has run into certain limitations. Some of you who might have tried out MOOCs know that there are some issues with it, especially around retention. After all, you will be alone in front of your computer doing these courses mostly on your own. And there was also issues with regarding credentials, whether people could actually count these courses towards the degrees, because there's obviously also in universities to propagate their own courses. Something that's being discussed more in the last years, and that you've surely also come across in your work at higher education organizations, is learning analytics. So here, big data really comes into play. You will all know different learning management systems from your universities where people can get access to course curricula, where files are shared, where maybe learning units are being put online, these learning management systems, and these are then combined with student info to really collect and analyze data about learning. And this is done for the purpose of understanding and optimizing learning and environments in which it occurs. So basically what we can do is we can use all the data that's collected on these digital platforms to generate insight into learning behavior, and then creates for predicting student progress. So a teacher might be receiving some support from a virtual device that says, oh, one student is at risk because they have not properly engaged or they have not completed all tasks. This is maybe worth another entire webinar, because there's also a big debate around whether you can actually measure learning through these data points, whether this is in line with data protection of students, etc. But this is definitely something to also keep an eye on something, especially the learning management systems will also reappear in the projects that we will show you on virtual exchange.
Great, thanks, Anna. So, I mean, at this point, we've come to hear about Coil virtual exchange. So what is that? Well, you might have encountered a number of different terms out in the field, anything from telecollaboration to online intercultural exchange to global virtual teams, and indeed virtual mobility, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I really like, they're often describing very similar pedagogical practices, but I really like collaborative online international learning, COIL, as a phrase, because it's exactly what it says it is. It's online collaboration done internationally across borders, and it involves some sort of learning activity. COIL as a term was coined in the State University of New York, and the way that the state SUNY operate COIL is quite structured. They envisage a practice that is very co-constructed between academics. It's set between a very set time period, 5 to 15 weeks, and there's some element of marking and grading and award to each side of the collaboration. But many universities around the world operate something that's much looser than that when they're talking about virtual exchange and COIL. And today, what I'm going to talk about is mostly in the Coventry vein, in which COIL is any sort of cross-border, cross-cultural collaboration that goes between countries, between two higher education institutions, and is online. It can be asynchronous or synchronous, so it can happen live or it can happen on an online forum board. And it's underpinned by jointly agreed learning objectives by the educators on either side of the collaboration. It may be assessed or it may not be assessed, but generally it's underpinned by some kind of reflection or student activity designed to consolidate what they've learned. And I think I'm going to come back to this idea of of all these terms that are floating out there, because there's sometimes an assumption that they all mean the same thing. Thanks, Sam. And actually, we need to be mindful of semantic concerns here. So virtual mobility is very much widely considered as people being able to move away from their home location to study study abroad. But there are some in the field, particularly Robert O'Dowd, who's very prominent in the virtual exchange literature. He's written a lot about virtual exchange and Coil practice. He's very adamant that we should not confuse virtual mobility and virtual exchange. He argues that they're different things. Virtual mobility is studying for a part of a qualification or a full qualification, effectively remotely from your home location, but it's validated by an international university. And that's compared with virtual exchange, which is very much more an in-course learning activity exchange. Now, not everyone shares O'Dowd's semantic clearness, but so for example, the second reference I've got there, they very much using it interchangeably. I think probably over time, what we'll see is that virtual exchange is an example of a type of virtual mobility, but I want you to be mindful of the semantic fuzziness that exists out there in the academic literature at the moment. And if you do encounter one of these terms, just be aware that different people are using them to mean slightly different things depending on the context. So having described what Coil is and just mentioned the semantic issues around it, if we accept that Coil is an international collaboration over a unit of learning, why might an educator want to do it? Well, actually, we can see Coil and virtual exchange is fitting into, and indeed wider virtual mobility is fitting into the broader internationalization concept in HE. That is this idea that universities are there to not just to develop learners who are conversant in their area, but they're getting transversal skills that are going to help them navigate an interconnected world, be it in employability terms or in terms of social justice and dealing with global values and global crises. We know from learning theory that social and experiential learning is generally pretty effective. Theorists like Vygotsky and Kolb would argue that collaborative learning, where people are experiencing something rather than just reading about it, is pedagogically a strong way to go. We can say that Coil, because it's online, is more inclusive and sustainable potentially than physical mobility. It's more inclusive because it can include people who have a variety of disabilities or learning preferences. And it's more sustainable because if we're not traveling, we're not using as much CO2. And also it's financially accessible it's cheaper to run in the long term, and it's more accessible for people who might not have the means to travel physically. It's generally pretty popular with students, although not without challenge. But generally we find that if you ask students what they want choice and flexibility and the opportunity to engage with lots of new things. And Coil would certainly seem to fit into that. And in terms of its potential, because of the flexibility in the content that you cover, although it can be subject aligned, you can make it about anything. So if there's other university strategic aims, for example, engaging with local community or making sure that students engage in some form of charitable endeavor or some form of social justice, you can build that in via something by service learning. Service learning is very much out of North America. It's the idea that you can get students to work on a project that's beneficial for them and some external stakeholder. And you can build that into a Coil practice, so it's very flexible. If you could click on the next animation, thanks, Hannah. And also it builds into this idea of the UN Sustainability Development Goals in terms of building global citizens, people who can work effectively with diverse others, work effectively together, and know how to learn and develop themselves throughout their lives. And are engaged with world issues. I'm not going to get into an argument about whether we should be higher education to develop global citizens, but if you do believe that's the case, you could certainly argue that Coil is a great way to do it. Thanks, Hannah. Oh, you're on mute.
So moving now from theory to practice, we wanted to give you some current examples of how Coil or virtual exchange are being implemented or promoted. And I think it's fair to say that for a long time, these types of learning experiences were pretty much bottom up, created by faculty that were interested in this, right? And then there have been some more systematic approaches in fostering virtual exchange, for instance, through the State University of New York, but it has really had a breakthrough with the pandemic. And I wanted to show you two examples from the German higher education system and how they are currently really promoting virtual exchange on different scales of organizational governance within the university. So let's start with a really huge flagship project by the German Academic Exchange Service. Those of you who are frequently dealing with internationalization will know the German Academic Exchange Service, or DAAD, as the National Agency for Higher Education Internationalization. And so they already, before the COVID pandemic, had started to think about this topic, and they mobilized a huge pot of funds to create a program called International Mobility and Cooperation through Digitalization, IMKD in German. And the goal here was to strengthen digitally supported transnational curricular and study programs, and to create digital infrastructure for student journey across international partner universities. So the idea was to take German universities who have already a conglomerate of partner universities and to really simplify the digital services across these partner universities. That means, if you remember from one of the first slides, for instance, the learning management systems, so that it's easy for students who might want to attend a virtual lecture to actually access the course catalog and sign up, and then really to have the entire student journey harmonized. The student journey really means everything from enrollment through transcript provision, etc. And then besides this infrastructural endeavor, there's also a teaching aspect to it, where, for instance, you will see on the bottom right corner, there is this picture of that says LFI avatar-based teaching. This is an example from one of the 6 universities that won this funding bid, the Technical University of Aachen. And so what they're currently doing, besides trying to harmonize the entire student journey infrastructure with some selected partners, they're also trying to create virtual blended mobility with some partner universities, for instance, in their master's program of European mining. So it's a technical school. Mining is a thing that you can study there. And what they do is they have created a virtual mine. So you put on these goggles and you will enter a mine, see it 3D, and students from different geographic backgrounds across the world can then enter this mine and work on certain issues collaboratively in the digital sphere. So this is very much state-of-the-art high tech. It's obviously something that takes a long time to implement and is also quite costly. This is really a flagship project where 6 universities got a total of 13.5 million euros. Then, of course, this is something that takes huge organizational effort across the university, right? There's a central administration involved, different course programs, degrees, different departments, etc. Something that is more easily realizable and maybe something that can be done on an individual request or desire to implement virtual exchange by faculty is another. It's called International Virtual Academic Collaboration, IVAC. So this was really a project that was initiated in response to the pandemic. And here the idea was to offer funding to university lecturers who would like to integrate this type of Coil experience that Mark just described. So it does not depend on the entire organization being behind it, but if really one professor or lecturer would like to do a collaborative course, then they can apply and they will receive funding to make it happen. There are some really interesting examples. You might think that Coil is, of course, especially popular with the language programs, right? Because intercultural learning is already something that is very much a part of these degrees. But just to give you examples of how also humanities can engage in this type of thing. So they're at Göttingen, they have a course called Virtual Supply Chain Management, teaching in Germany and Italy. And so there they had online lectures, and they had digital units where students could learn, and they also collected data on chain management together. And this is now used as a database. And then an example from the literary studies, Global Shakespeare 2.0. So here they had a course that was actually done across 4 universities, one of them being Göttingen in Germany, 2 in China, or no, 2 in India and 1 in China. And what they did was do Shakespeare together and to really see how is this author received across different cultures, to get a non-canonical view and to see how does the reception of an author that is so well known and frequently treated in universities, how does it differ across different cultural contexts? I think that is really interesting, and it kind of shows the breadth of how you can engage with this type of learning activity.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, Anna, a project I'm going to talk about is called Aikudu. It's very much another one of these grand projects funded by the European Union, and it's a capacity building project between universities in Europe and universities in South Africa. And I think it's a really nice, it's designed to build in Coil activities and facilitate these connections between the universities. And it is capacity building with the funding coming from Europe. But what's really nice about Aikudu is there's always this slight tension in when you're looking at Coil practices that are happening between countries that potentially have a mismatch in resources and financing. There's a potential for power imbalance there. You know, there's questions around colonial, decolonization and colonial legacy. And there's the inherent assumptions that a more developed context is always providing information, technical expertise and knowledge towards a less developed context. And actually, Aikudu takes a very much more of an appreciative and inclusive tack. So the idea is that when the universities are collaborating, it's co-construction of knowledge. You know, the educators are encouraged to work together and bring their own expertise. And even though many of the universities in South Africa may have some issues around connectivity and technology stability, what they also have is a huge depth in terms of teacher expertise and African ways of teaching and learning through storytelling and use of images that can be shared and can form a vital part of a Coil practice. So this idea of kind of reciprocal development is very much the ethos of the Aikudu project. And I think it's a great example of how Coil can transcend these traditional power boundaries and show a way forward through true collaboration so that people from very different parts of the world can work together and learn together. I think it's quite an exciting project. They're well into the Aikudu project now. We've already had set up, facilitated, and finished several Coil projects, and there's more coming on stream this academic year. And they're across a range of different subject areas, you know, from business to marketing to engineering. So really interesting project. Right, I think probably if we move on to the next slide. Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, and then finally moving to some recommendations from the field that we've collected in our interviews and our contact with administrators and facilitators of these activities. So this might seem like a no-brainer, but it's actually, I guess, one of the most frequently mentioned issues is actually facilitating learning for people who are in very different time zones potentially. And some of the administrators that I've interviewed also said that there was a lot of deliberation that went into figuring out how much content do you provide online asynchronously so that students can just access it whenever they want, and how much synchronous activities do you have, and to what extent do you manage those, right? So if you give group work to students in different countries, to what extent do you set a certain timeline for them, or do you leave it completely up to them, as they might have very specific schedules that they might need to follow. So this is important to keep in mind, besides obviously also potentially different academic calendars. So having an eye on both asynchronous and synchronous components is very important. In cases where one student group has to speak another language that they're not, that is not their native language, which is probably the case for most of these projects, it's of course also important to sensibilize the speakers that might be more fluent to some issues that the non-native speakers might run into. And of course, when the group meets for the first time, we all know this in a virtual sphere, it can be a bit awkward to meet for the first time. It's important to prepare certain icebreakers that allow them to meet and exchange with other learners in the group and to get to know each other a bit more informally. And then, of course, it's always important to have an eye on the group dynamics, especially in intercultural work settings. This is, of course, another huge thing that needs its own workshop probably, but just to be sensitive to these issues. In terms of the course content, this is something that is really the responsibility of the two people facilitating the course together, to negotiate the learning units and objectives and milestones, to create some kind of student orientation in the beginning, and as was just mentioned, the ongoing group facilitation throughout the course.
Right, I'm just mindful, I think we might be running over time, Anna, so I'm going to race through the last little bit. Technology assessment and future research. I mean, it goes without saying that you're going to need significant staff support and an awareness of the facilitating technology if you're going to set up a Coil. There's lots that's been written about this in the case studies, but basically the short of it is, if it's accessible for students, then it's accessible for everyone. So if academics need to work out what works best for them first, and then it probably will work best for the students. In terms of assessment, there's arguments over how things should be assessed in Coil. Generally speaking, most of the projects tend to go on the lines of not assessing the group work, but assessing some form of individual contribution about the group work, so a form of reflection. But there's lots of different ways to do that. Predominantly, the group output tends to be a presentation or a report. And in terms of future research, we don't know yet if Coil is effective in the long term. There's lots that's been written about student experience, but less so about staff experience. And there's lots to be done around intersectional factors. And what I mean by that is, how do things like disability and personal circumstance intersect with the Coil experience to influence a student's personal experience? Finally, I'm not going to read all this out since we're so short of time, but if you are interested in further reading, we put together a list of further reading suggestions with the highlighted in bold key themes there. One thing I just quickly highlight would be that top one. O'Dowd is a great paper if you just want to learn a little bit more about virtual exchange and the general issues. And field number 3 is really interesting as an example of a perspective across potentially problematic cultural divide. Just a really interesting case study between Christian and Islamic students. I'm going to basically zoom ahead and say, right, thank you very much for listening, and we're happy to take questions if we've got time for it. And sorry, Matty, for running over a little bit.